Hello, friends. Welcome to Mike Reads the World. Today we're talking about we, or actually, first we're going to talk about us. And by us, I mean me, because today I've rebranded, I guess you could say, the channel as Mike Reads the World. Going forward, this channel is going to be just dedicated to this project of reading international literature from this day forward. And the title says it simply, exactly what it is, and it also helps shorten my video titles so I don't have to put reading the world in front of every video. You can just read the channel name and know why it's being numbered. So, now that I've talked about me, us, we can talk about we by Yevgeny Zamyatin from Russia. This is the second one from Russia, and actually he was the one of the first Soviet dissidents, I guess, is the way the back of the book describes it. This was the first book to be banned in the Soviet Union after it was formed. It was written in the early 1920s, or published first in the early 1920s. It was actually published first in English and French, I believe. The first English translation is from like 1924. I'll talk about that. The translation that I have here is actually a newer translation by Bela Shayevich. And I am kind of debating because I did listen, after reading this one, I listened to like the first half of the, like an audio format of the 1920 translation. And there were some things I liked better about the older translation. And revealed some of some things. There is a little bit of outdatedness in like the way they describe, certain people's racial features and like how women are referred to in certain parts. But so this translation, I think, kind of covers up a little bit of that. And I don't know what is more faithful to the original Russian. I have no way of knowing that. So there are some subtle differences. I recommend, if you're interested in this book, which is one of the first dystopian works of fiction that inspired George Orwell's 1984, Ursula K. Le Guin. It's a giant in the science fiction world, especially in like utopian, dystopian literature. But I recommend that if this does interest you, you look at the different translations and try to read a little bit of both and see which one you like better. Yeah, they're a little bit different. And there are two other translations as well. So there's a total of at least 4 translations into English. And I know at least one in French. So all that being said, we're looking at a totalitarian state of the future. There's been a cataclysmic event which is called the 200 Years' War, in which most of humanity was wiped out. And the survivors built this kind of perfect, in their mind, utopian society where all daily activities are regulated except for 2 hours of the day that are free hours. And those are separated throughout the day. But basically, you only have 2 hours where you're free, and they have like pink tickets that you can use to basically request alone time with, another member of society. So it's kind of a free love, free sex type of society. And all you have to do to get it is to use a pink ticket to request it, and that person basically has to grant it, I believe. So it's kind of an interesting collective society, and the description of it, if I can describe like what it is aesthetically, it's kind of hard to pin down. Everybody's living in a dome, and outside the dome is sort of just the green desert, they call it. So basically there's just kind of jungle or forest. Everything's kind of, the vegetation is all re-come up, and it's just nature outside of the dome. Everybody lives inside the dome And there's some weather control mechanics so that the skies are always blue or mostly blue. There aren't like storms or anything. There's tall glass buildings basically where everything is glass. So all rooms are see-through, although every room does have blinds that come down to cover things up during that hour of free time where you might use a pink ticket to have a friend over, you know? So uh, the society is very open, like you have no privacy essentially, and no very little decision of what to do with your time. Our narrator is an engineer who is working on a ship for the totalitarian state, and this ship is going to be launched into outer space to basically spread the word of the perfect society. So it is kind of hard to sum all that up. I want to give you an idea of what, at least for me in science fiction books, the aesthetic, the setting, the idea is really important, that it's something interesting that I want to explore. And to sum that up, so this guy is the lead engineer working on this ship that's going to bring the message of the one state, the perfect one state, to the stars, to Jupiter, to Mars, to Venus, Mercury, wherever, and imagining that there are beings on all the planets in our solar system. This is the 1920s, remember, so like they had no idea. And so that's something to keep in mind too. Some of the things in this book might seem a little bit like, oh yeah, that's already been done, but remember, this is 1920s, and if you keep in mind the time period that this was written, it just seems like insanely ahead of its time. You know, there's definitely types of flying devices in the city, um, and the this engineer who's in charge of building the ship is kind of being tempted by this mysterious woman, I-330, I think it is, or 331 or something. They call her I often, which is a bit confusing because the narrator's saying I, like narrating, but then he'll refer to I as the character, and I don't know if that's intentional or artistic, and that's also in the Russian. But anyway, and a lot of times the main character will actually be narrating as we, because the society is a we society. But this woman character, she kind of gets under his skin a bit and kind of makes him start questioning and plants seeds of individualism and free thinking in him a bit as he is writing this series of logs which they're going to send on the ship that he's building. So the book that you're holding, like they're all broken into logs, like log 15, 16, 17, they're just all logs, right? And they all have titles like The Brief, The Bell, The Mirroring Sea, I Will Burn Eventually. This whole thing is supposed to be an epic poem that all citizens are required to write. Like anyone who can is supposed to write this kind of epic poem about the one state, the one true state, to send to the stars, to the planets, to spread the word. So this book is actually supposed to be like you're reading his log. And there will even be like, oh, a stain fell on page 38 or something, for example, and then you actually go to page 38 and it tells you like here a stain fell or whatever. So it's kind of interesting that way, and a little bit avant-garde, I think, for also the time that it was written. I don't know if stuff like that had been done. Maybe. I'm always surprised. I'm always surprised at old books how modern they actually, how much more modern they are than the stodgy sort of impression that we have of the classics. So anyway, what did I think of it? Without giving too much away, so this character I-330 is kind of like bringing. It's really cool. One of my favorite parts, and it happens pretty early on, is they go to this house of antiquity, or in the other translation they call it the ancient house, I think, or something like that. But inside is kind of like records of humanity's past, and they're familiar with, and they see like works of Pushkin or Dostoevsky they mention, and it's like it's great that we don't live in those barbaric days, right? And that's very interesting. And you might think also that this is the kind of book that's like gonna be your typical like, oh, it's a totalitarian utopian state is actually a bad thing and it's oppressive, and like, yeah, there is all that, but there are really interesting questions in the book about what is the alternative. And um, I was not sure how much I liked it as I was going, because there is kind of a mix of like, okay, I've read this before, but I'm also read this kind of thing before, but then I'm also understanding that the time period it was written, this was really out of nowhere and revolutionary, and I didn't even know like how deep is this dialectic gonna go, like this order versus chaos, like how much what's the purpose of trying to create a perfect society if there's no freedom, is kind of the main question, which is especially meaningful at the beginning of the Soviet Union. And if this is supposed to be like a image of the Soviet Union and what it was trying to do, which I'm not exactly sure it was, because remember, this is before a lot of the Soviet Union even really developed. It was in their early years, but it was projecting that ideology forward, maybe, and saying, like, what if the Soviet Union actually achieved a perfect society where everybody's equal and so on, and then creating that vision. I'm not convinced that that's what this is, kind of what the inspiration was for this, because I don't know a whole lot about the author and whatever, but that is certainly a way you could read it. But very interesting to think that it was written without the context of having seen how so many communist states actually failed, and imagining what if it succeeded, and why would that be a bad thing, is kind of the long way I'm getting it to it. Or potentially, what is the alternative of striving to create a perfect society? Because if we don't strive at all and we just accept chaos, then what are we? What are we left with? And is it better to tear down the society and have a chaotic world, instead of just you know accepting what we have and using what we have? Uh, it's so the I was torn between whether I was going to like it or not. It all depended on whether it nailed the ending, and I think it absolutely nailed the ending. The ending was fantastic. Didn't give me cut and dried answers, which I always love. It's a little bit of a cliffhanger. Like you could probably write a sequel, but you're supposed to write the sequel in your mind. And I think it's very fitting at the time that this was written that it was left as a non-definite ending of what's going to happen in the future. Um, and it's not a feel-good ending by any means, but it's also not an ending that's like crushingly sad or anything. It's just really thought-provoking in the way that science fiction often tries to be. And some parts of the book were quite trippy, quite fever dream like, especially as the main character's reality of understanding himself in the context of we, and shifting more to I and what do I choose, that his reality kind of starts to fall apart. And there's also some very, I don't know if I want to say Dickensian characters in this book. Like, the, there's characters that are described extremely caricature like there's a doctor that his mouth is described always as moving like a scissors, and this seems to go across multiple translations, and that he's almost like, this doctor is almost described as like a 2D cutout. And I'm wondering if some characters that are described in this bizarre way are supposed to be like technological aberrations, or if they're like metaphors. There's something a little bit surreal about this book too, in that sense, and like, you feel this alienness of the world that you're reading. Like there's some kind of technology here you don't understand, maybe, or people have evolved or changed in a certain way, and it's symbolizing that. But it is actually a real thing that's happening in the book. It's not just a symbol, I don't think. So, and I will say one difference between the translations. This one by Bela Shayevich actually does a better job of making you feel like you're in an alien world, like a world that's quite different to our own. Um, and the other translation, I felt, makes it a little bit more relatable and a little bit more grounded, as if it were like a society kind of in our particular reality. So depending kind of what feel you're going for, that's why I recommend you check out the two different or multiple translations, and see, maybe read the first chapter or so if you can find samples, and decide what's best for you. So yeah, I did enjoy it, and I'm moving more and more away in my life from science fiction. Most science fiction and fantasy as well kind of tends to fall apart for me, the world, because it's just too hard to build a world. it feels so small. I find the worlds of the past that are from the minds of authors, or even present, like working in our actual world. I mean, our actual world is so complicated and so immersive that that's all you need. All you need is to place me in some part that I've never been to of this world, or even an area that I've been to. But this whole, I mean, you can build magical descriptions and powerful, epic imagery, and these sort of beautiful constructions that I used to think were only possible in science fiction and fantasy. But to me, that's really all a superficial facade. Like, the real depth and magic can be found in the smallest things, and that's part of, I think, just the maturity of growing up and realizing our time is finite, and finding the power in magic in small things, and and how expansive just the moment of being in an apartment can be, or a conversation with a friend, or a walk, and those kind of things being transmitted in literature, I think are much more moving and powerful and interesting than like building this facade or fictitious world that you know it's just, but at the same time, I loved like graphic novels that make these really crazy looking worlds, and like I love myth, and mythology is part of our world too. So I think fantasy and sci-fi is much more powerful to me when it connects to myth, or when it connects to our modern world and philosophy. Like, I love the fact that in this book, Dostoevsky's mentioned, Pushkin is mentioned. Now he's been mentioned in like every single Russian book I've read. So uh, up to this point, so like having that connection and reaching into some philosophical depth, or something like that, is important to me in sci-fi and fantasy. Otherwise, it's just, I don't know. I feel like I don't get much pleasure out of just a good Lord of the Rings style epic. And I'm not bashing Lord of the Rings, but Lord of the Rings did Lord of the Rings. And if I wanted to read Lord of the Rings, I'd read that, not just another like imitation of a band of heroes that has to achieve a certain objective. And it's been done. And anyway, that was my typical ramble, just kind of an opinion. Um, but yeah, We by Yevgeny Zamyatin. Obviously, as always, there's more I could say about it, but I don't want to introduce any real spoilers. This book is much better the less you know about it, and the more conclusions you can draw on your own. One cool thing, if you're fans of Margaret Atwood or Ursula Le Guin, there are essays by them as well as George Orwell contained in this edition. I have not read them carefully. I kind of, after reading the book, I just skim them a bit. But if you're interested in what they have to say about this, probably the most influential utopian or dystopian novel in the world, now that I realize how many of the giants were influenced by it, uh, yeah, that's alone a good reason to get this edition, if that's something that interests you. So once again, thank you for following the project. I don't have a country to cross off this time because this is a part 2. So next time we'll see what we do. I'm not sure what the next one's going to be, but stay tuned, and thank you for following me, Mike, as I read the world. Thanks, and have a great day.